that's when unions really got their start, and they created 5 jobs for every one real job, and they could do that because the rest of the world had been decimated by war, and so we made a lot of policy mistakes. We made a lot of wrong choices in our government policies, and now it's time to pay the piper. Instead of being proactive in those times and setting us up for the long run, we see Brazil. They made a lot of good government policy decisions, and they are now the beneficiary. That's why the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are set up to do real well right now, and countries like Europe and the United States are now reaping and Mexico are reaping the consequences of their government policy mistakes. And so, we made mistakes back then, and we're paying the price now.
Speaking of states, we were also talking last hour about this rally that's going to take place in Austin tomorrow by a group called the Texas Nationalist Movement. They say they have over 1 million signatures on their petition. They want to put a non-binding ballot question on the November 2011 ballot, where Texans would express their approval of, although it would again be a non-binding vote, of seceding from the United States. And all of this has been fueled by this, open warfare between the states and the federal government over everything from immigration to taxes to regulation to the drilling permatorium in the Gulf. I mean, no matter where you go in this country, the issues change, but the battle stays the same. Do we live in states with sovereign rights, or are we all ultimately and totally under the thumb of the federal government? We all know the history. We know how we were supposed to be conceived and set up originally. What about this idea of secession? Is it just completely loony? Is it something that should be considered? Is it a good threat for the states to make? Could it actually be followed through?
I think it's actually a threat. I mean, hasn't states like Vermont tried this before, and other states? I mean,
Vermont, they're always so stoned, and it's
don't
cold.
They talk
and it
about
never
that?
really gets past the talk stage.
Well, I think that's what I think that we are more progressive in our planning than
we're doers.
that.
If we say we're going to do something, we
do it. That's right. And it always has been. Texas, a whole other country.
But does it have value as a threat, Nikki, in the sense that sooner or later, there's got to be some way for the states to say get off our back?
I think that this particular moment in time, I think that there is a little bit more promise behind that threat.
I don't have any problem with it being on the ballot. I'd actually be interested in seeing how people would vote on that. But to me, and I've talked to people about this issue before, and to me it's one of those devils in the details type of situations. And I know you were talking about some of those details, but
very complicated.
But
to do
yeah,
this,
you're dealing with retirees. What about Social Security? Are we going to have some kind of system for them? What about Medicare? Postal Service, I know they talked about a militia, but wouldn't we need some kind of military that's a little more than that? What about border issues? Are we now suddenly going to be having the same border issues with New Mexico and Louisiana and Oklahoma that we now have with Mexico? And I mean, we're going to have higher taxes.
Why couldn't we just be a helpless foreign nation that depends on
I like that.
from the United
That
States?
works for me.
That's what everybody else does.
That works for me, but
and they don't have any strings attached to their money like ours does.
See, that's persuasive. I think,
right.
but I think we're looking at either much higher sales taxes or an income tax, which is Texas. In Texas, those are fighting words.
It'd have to be an income.
Is that offset by the fact you're not paying a federal income tax anymore?
Possibly.
Isn't Texas a rich enough state that if it got to keep its own wealth and its mineral wealth, and it didn't have to participate in this Robin Hood federal government, wouldn't Texas be a very prosperous state on its own? I mean, maybe not every state can say that, but we can.
I think it would become a less prosperous state because it would inherit all these burdens. And I know it's dealing with some of these burdens anyway, and some of these come down to the states. But these burdens would fall completely on the state. We're talking about the burden of defending itself against foreign nations. I just think that's where we're going to put Texas in a position where we are our prosperous state might be affected by that.
I think it boils down that the world needs the United States, because if we're not around, then who leads? China leads. And so when Texas, one of the most prosperous states in the United States, secedes, then that just hurts the United States more. And if we don't get our act together and let the federal government deal with the big issues that they should be dealing with, for example,
It's
immigration
not that we're not
reform.
letting them, it's that they're not
No,
doing
they're
it.
outsourcing immigration reform to the states, and it's causing this problem in Arizona and now in Texas. They need to be responsible with their purview and let the states handle their issues that are real regionally based.
But if we are already on the brink of the U.S. Slipping to second, place status in the world, if the dollar is already on the ropes, if we're already all pretty much in agreement that the federal government has abdicated its responsibilities on things like immigration and 100 other things, then how else are you going to get their attention, Louis?
Well, let me tell you something. Okay, if Texas is so great a place, then how come we're so low compared to other states in education? And education is synonymous with income. So initially, yeah, we can be like an oil-rich state of Saudi Arabia because we got the Eagle Ford Shell. But what's going to happen with our human capital isn't prepared for the new jobs of the new economy, then Texas will be just like the other guys that, since they take all their...
I would turn that around and say it can't get worse.
Oh, it can always
It can't get no. I mean, what are we, 49th?
We're at the bottom.
I mean, we're 49th by the metrics of a federal Department of Education, which from whom we take a lot of direction and to whom we pay a lot of our hard-earned money. Maybe we'd be doing better. Maybe we would have our own ideas, and we would have our own curricula, and we would have our own system of training teachers and deciding who gets paid what in the teaching profession. I would like to try something new.
Definitely entertaining thought.
But do we have that much faith? I mean, that basically you're saying the people who we now have in our legislature, essentially we're talking about those types of people, we have more faith in them. And maybe you could make that argument, but do we really have that much more faith in them?
Well, I think a really cautionary note is, who are the Sam Houstons or the John Adams or the
That's right.
Thomas Jeffersons on the scene right now? And I'm a little perplexed by that myself. But I will say this: you're never going to find out if you keep saying and waiting on Washington. That's what we're doing right now. We're a nation of people waiting on Washington. We keep waiting. We keep thinking one more election, more of my guys and fewer of your guys, or vice versa, and we'll turn this thing around. When are we going to wake up to the fact that
When
that is
people
not
get
happening?
Re-engaged, less and less people vote, less and less people get involved in the political process.
But Louis,
And-
they only have two parties to vote for, and the two parties are virtually identical to each other. We just ping-pong back and forth. You could have 100% voter turnout,
No, you-
but if all they have are Republicans and Democrats to choose from,
Right, but
whatever
you
changes.
still vote for people. You have to identify people. At the end of the day, Barack Obama was the one who led the Democrats into this big sweep election, and then he is the one who led the Republicans into this big sweep election. So we have to cultivate leaders. We have to realize that as the people, we are the shareholders of the city, of the state, of this country, and if we outsource all of our responsibilities to somebody else and then appease ourselves with anger and blame, then we're never going to get to our problems being solved.
See, there's a timidity to this argument, nothing personal, but if we really believe we are facing grave circumstances and we're on the brink of something, then don't we need the kind of bold thinking that's contained in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence? I mean, don't we need to be bolder than to just say more people need to vote and better people and engagement? We've been hearing that for 100 years.
And they haven't done it.
You know, the argument that you make, which I understand, the idea of like, let's scare them and let's put some fear into them by threatening to do this, even if it's something that doesn't actually happen. But the problem is that I think the ultimate conflict that our federal leaders have always had, which is they don't want to make the tough choice. They're put in positions where they're either going to have to cut programs that they fear that their voters are going to get angry about, or they're going to have to raise taxes, which is also going to be unpopular, and they never want to make that choice because they're thinking short term. And even if Texas threatens to leave, that same mindset will exist in our federal leaders, I think.
Well, I think also if something actually did happen, I think we're going to end up with a crisis within, if we become our own country, a crisis within our own country. And what did we solve then? We solved nothing.
You don't believe that freed of federal mandates, freed of the oppressive income tax, we would be able to come up with a better way of doing this on our own?
I think we would struggle at first.
Well, sure we would.
Yeah, and I think that by that time, though, that we came up with the solution, we would be...
There are some hard times ahead, Nikki, either way, though.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
we're
fair
facing
enough.
some very hard times in this country. I mean, we're facing children and grandchildren who aren't even born yet, who will perhaps be under 60, 70% income tax rates. So if we do nothing, the future doesn't look bright at all. It looks bleak. I'd rather try something else and say, well, that didn't work as well as I hoped, but at least I have more control over my destiny than I have right now. My unborn grandchildren are going to owe hundreds of thousands of dollars per person before they've ever drawn a breath. That's
But the
that's
90s
immoral to me.
The 90s showed us that when this economy starts growing, it can just rage on and eliminate all the deficits. But we've got to quit making government policy mistakes. And we have been doing a lot of that because we are distracted from the real problems at stake. We get emotional, all these divisive emotional issues. We've got to get the emotion out, start looking at the facts and weigh them out. Just like we talked about the VLTs. Okay, let's get the emotions out, let's have the debate, let's have an honest, true debate as best as we can, and then we'll let the people decide based on the findings.
Now, Louis, you said we have to choose better people to lead us and represent us,
Yes,
right?
yes.
When we choose those people and we send them to Washington, what happens to them?
Well, it's basically they have to raise so much money. You know, at one time they used to hang out together, Republicans and Democrats, after their sessions. They would go to dinner together. They would play golf together. Now,
As far as I know, they still do.
well, not necessarily. I just got back from D.C. and we were talking to Senator John Thune's office staff. He's the Senatorial Republican Committee chair, and I was debating and discussing what immigration reform can bring, and they asked me the question, have you spoken to the D's about this? In other words, they don't speak to another. If they get an idea that they think will resonate with the other side, they ask us to
But
be
my
the errand
question is,
boys.
what happens to good people when you send them into that machine? They don't stay the way they were, do they? And you started to say it's because they have to raise a lot of money.
They have to raise a lot of money.
They immediately start running for re-election, and eventually their job isn't representing us. Their job is maintaining political power and maintaining themselves in political office, right?
Well,
So no matter how many good people we find and send,
Depends
we
on-
keep sending them into that machine.
Depends on their goals. If they're going to keep running for higher office, like first they're going to be a congressman, then they're going to be a senator, they're going to be Senate Majority Leader, then they're going to run for president, then they're always appeasing the base. If they're there to do the right thing, and they don't care if they lose their next election, and they're going to fight for the right thing, as we're seeing with a lot of these freshmen, the 87 freshmen that are there right now in Congress are saying, oh, hold the bus.
It's only March. We'll see how brave they are.
We'll see how
year.
it goes. But as of right now, they've been holding the line, and they've been controlling the conversation instead of following around. So, hey, time will tell.
If anything, this makes an argument for federal or congressional term limits, which I think is an issue that's been talked about a long time. This idea that you become part of a permanent part of the machine. I think that might be one way to come.
I guess it's disheartening to hear how little confidence we have in ourselves within the borders of this state. Well, there are 25 million people here. To hear you talk, you're so wary and frightened of the possibility that we would have to figure this out within the borders of Texas. But when I look at how they're figuring it out in Washington and the people who are figuring it out and what they're coming up with, I find it very hard to believe that we could do any worse than that.
We would have to write a new Texas Constitution. I mean, the old one's diluted. I mean, what would be some of the things that we would have to put in that?
You have a great starting document. You have the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, Jack, let's say that it works. Let's say that Texas is able to succeed and they're very strong financially and the education starts getting better. What happened in Chicago with Mayor Daley's time? His city was named the city that works, and everything started booming because he controlled every aspect of the government, made it very efficient. The one thing he didn't count on was the poor black migrant that came over from Louisiana, and he didn't know where to put them. They didn't work in his city that works, and he created the housing projects, Cabrini Green, etc., and that's what kind of threw him off. There's always some wrench in the system that you don't see coming that will make it worse than it was.
I'm worried about the
beginning.
wrench in the system I do see coming, Louis. Just what I see coming down the road makes me think we cannot stay on this crazy train with Washington. And remember that the people who are up there are not going to have to live under the catastrophe that they're about to visit on all of us. They don't have to live under those health care laws. They don't have to come out and find a job like we do.